All right, welcome to video number 2, where we are going to take a little tour of compression, of all the different components inside of a compressor. Because you may know some of these things. If you've used a compressor at all in the past, then you're going to know what threshold is and what ratio is most likely. Or maybe you've never touched compression, you really want to get into it and you don't know the first thing about it. Either way, we're going to cover each component, and if you think it's something you already know, I'd encourage you to continue to watch the video because there's a lot of things involved when it comes to compression. There are a lot of knobs and settings and things that can drastically change how that compressor sounds. So you may only be using 2 or 3 of the knobs when there are 2 or 3 more that you could be using to further change the sound and could be really useful for you in certain situations. So things like attack and release can be really important. So we're going to get into the practical aspect of how to use those in later videos. But first, you and I need to be on the same page as far as what all the knobs are on a compressor, what they're called, and what they do. And then we'll get into showing you how they work later on. So I've got a session here that's got a bunch of tracks, and we're going to come into this drum subgroup. All the drums are running through this track, and we'll put a compressor on here. Now I'm going to use the stock compressor that comes with Pro Tools, and if you're not using Pro Tools, that's not a problem. Every compressor I've ever used just about on any DAW platform, whether it's Pro Tools, Logic, Cubase, or any third-party plugins, they all have the same basic components. They're all going to have input, output, gain reduction, attack, release, ratio, gain, threshold. That means those basic things are going to be in all of them. So if your plugins don't look exactly like this, don't worry, that's not a problem. You're still going to get, I'm still going to explain this to you, and it'll take you just a second or two to apply that to your own setup. So don't be discouraged. If you're not a Pro Tools fan, that's fine. All of these concepts, this is just compression in general. I happen to use Pro Tools, but this applies to any plugin you might use that's a compressor, or if you're doing live sound and you use compression in your live sound setup, these concepts will apply just as well to that. So let's jump in and take a look at this compressor. So at first glance, there's a lot of things going on here. You've got your levels over here. There's all these different lines. You've got some sort of a graph here, and then all of these knobs, and then these up here. So let's focus our attention first over here. This is where you're going to get all your metering or levels. This is where you're going to check to make sure things aren't clipping and see how much gain reduction is going on. So your first set of meters here is your input meters, and this is left and right because this is on a stereo track, and this just shows us what level is coming into this fader here. So I've got audio playing, it's muted so you don't have to hear it right now, but there's a drum kit coming through this, and as you can see there's a level coming in here. Now the signal is going to come through the compressor, we're going to do lots of stuff to it, and then it's going to come back out obviously and pass on down the channel and to the rest of the mix. So you want to make sure that whatever you're doing here with a compressor isn't causing it to clip on the output. And the way to measure that is there's this meter here that shows you your output gain and also has 2 little red lights up here in case it starts clipping, which you can see there. As I crank it up, that's clipping. So any compressor worth using is going to have some sort of way to meter it and tell if things are clipping. If it doesn't, then I would say steer clear of it and use something else, because sometimes you can't hear the distortion or the clipping that's happening, but it's happening there, and that can build up over time. So you just want to make sure that you're doing everything in your power to prevent clipping. And then the third meter here is GR, and it'll be labeled different things depending on your compressor. A lot of times it's going to be labeled GR, which stands for gain reduction. And if you remember from the first video, gain reduction is simply how much of the dynamic range we're reducing. So if this signal, for example, has 60 dB of dynamic range and we're reducing it down to 45, then we've essentially introduced a gain reduction of -15. And as we talked also in that first video, it's not that we're turning it down by -15, we're actually compressing the signal. So we're bringing the quieter parts up a little bit, the louder parts down a little bit, until we've reduced and squashed that dynamic range by 15 dB. And the way to measure that is here with this gain reduction. So if we pull down the threshold here, and I'll explain that in just a second, you can tell that this is now compressing because this meter is jumping. So wherever it's jumping, it's hanging out around 12 to 18 dB of gain reduction. And it's constantly moving because the level feeding into the compressor is constantly changing as well. So you're not going to have a steady gain reduction all the time, but you can. It's very easy to just glance over at this compressor and say, looks like it's hanging out around maybe negative 10 dB and it peaks up around negative 18. And that's useful information. Okay, so that's the gain reduction meter. That's one of the most important because as you're compressing, it's good to keep an eye on that. General rule of thumb, for most things, I don't want to compress it much more than 6 or 10 dB of gain reduction. Most of my tracks, to be honest, I'll only compress by maybe 3 or 4 dB. And there's some, like vocals, you can get away with more. Bass guitar, I can usually compress by 10, maybe 15 dB, just depending on the song and the tone and how it sounds. And they can handle compression a little better. But in general, I don't want this thing to be jumping way down here, usually. If it is, I'm probably compressing it too much, and that's going to squash the life out of whatever I'm compressing. Okay, so let's move on to this section here, which is kind of another form of metering. It's not technically a meter. This is something, when I first learned compression, I learned it in context of a graph like this. And this can be really good to help you learn compression, and it can also be dangerous because you get used to looking at this instead of listening to the audio to determine how much compression you're going to use. But basically, this line here that we're seeing is your threshold. And the threshold, we'll take a second here to explain that. The threshold is simply the level at which compression is going to begin. So it's basically just a volume measurement. So as you can see, this knob here is our threshold knob. So as we turn this down, you'll see a couple of things. This line here moves and this little arrow moves. And what we're saying is anything above the threshold is going to get compressed. So right now, if the signal reaches above negative 11.3 dB, which is about halfway up here, then it will get compressed. As you can see, the signal's not getting up there, so there's no compression happening yet. However, if we drop it down to, say, negative 50, or around negative 50 dB, suddenly it is being compressed because the signal is above negative 50. So anytime the signal crosses negative 50, it starts to introduce compression and gain reduction. Gain reduction and compression, you'll hear those, I'll use those words interchangeably to pretty much mean the same thing. Now, as you can see, it's not always compressing it. When the signal drops off and gets below the threshold, then you'll see the compressor drops down too. So it's not compressing once the signal drops below wherever you've set the threshold. So that's important. That's useful if you only want to compress certain sections of a song or a performance, or you only want the louder notes to be compressed and not the softer notes. That's a part of what using the threshold can allow you to do. Okay, so we've established threshold. That's probably the first thing you're going to adjust. One of the most important things, especially when you're mixing. If you think, you're listening to everything and you think the drums, the compression doesn't sound quite right, you'll come over here and you'll probably adjust the threshold as the first thing. Threshold is another way, if you want to simplify it in your mind, threshold is basically how much compression is going to happen. Because as you can see, as I lower this threshold, if you'll watch the gain reduction meter, it's going to slowly increase. So there's more and more and more and more compression going on, more gain reduction. That's what the threshold's going to do for you. Okay, so let's move over here. The next important thing you need to know is the ratio. Now, you'll notice the ratio, if you remember back into your math days, algebra, or wherever it was that you study ratios, it's simply a fraction. So this is 3 to 1, the little colon here, 3 to 1 ratio. So that means for every dB the signal crosses the threshold, it's going to be turned down by 3 dB. And as we turn it up, it's going to be more and more. You'll notice as I turn this up, this part of this line here goes down on the graph. And what that's representing is more and more, the higher the ratio is, the more dramatic the compression. So you'll notice if I leave the threshold here and set the ratio to a low number, it's compressing around 3 dB or so. As I raise the threshold, as I raise the ratio up to 20 or higher, now it's compressing at 12 dB. You'll notice I haven't moved the threshold. The same amount of signal is getting to the compressor. It's just being compressed a whole lot more. So that's the ratio is, we're going to spend a lot of time messing around with ratio and different approaches to how to set the ratio and all of those things. But you should know ratio is just how much compression is happening. So while the threshold tells you when you want it to start compressing, at what level you want it to start compressing, the ratio says once you've crossed the threshold, once you've gone past that level, how much are we going to compress it? So typically when you watch me mix, I'm going to be compressing anywhere from probably 2 to 4 dB or so, or 2 to 4. The ratio will be 4 to 1, 2 to 1, somewhere in there. I'll occasionally jump up to something higher like 10 to 1. I'm usually not doing anything dramatic like 60 to 1 or 100 to 1 or anything like that. Usually going to hang out at a lower number. And that's just me personally. Some folks like to compress it a lot and use a high ratio. It's just a matter of taste, but that's what the ratio does. It determines once you cross the threshold, once the signal is starting to compress, how much is it going to compress at that point. The next one here, and you won't see this on every compressor, is called knee. Now, the knee is an interesting feature. If you can look here, let me go back to this graph and explain what's happening. This little dot that's dancing around, that represents the signal. And as you can see here, these numbers represent dB. So as the signal comes up in level from 60 up to our threshold, which is set to around 30, it's a linear increase in volume. The signal gets louder and louder, no problem. Once it crosses the threshold, as you can see, the line curves a different way. That represents a 4 to 1 ratio of compression. So once the signal, it's not going to go in a straight line anymore, it's going to curve more this way. And as the input signal gets much louder, it's only going to get a little bit louder coming out of the compressor. So that's the whole idea. The compressor, the signal is going to go in, and the signal that comes out the other side isn't going to be as loud as the original signal. So this signal, you can see it's jumping up here to probably around negative 20, negative 15 dB in loudness, but the actual output isn't going to be much more than negative 20, negative 25 or something, because the compressor is turning it down once it gets above there. So as you can see, when I adjust the ratio, it's adjusting how much it gets turned down. And the knee is an interesting little feature. It basically, as you can see here, the difference between before the threshold and after, it's a fairly sharp angle on this line. As we turn up the knee, that's basically turning up making that a smoother line. So as you can see, instead of coming to the threshold and then sharply turning to the right, it's more of a smooth transition. And it tends to sound more natural. So the compression is starting a little bit below the threshold and isn't fully in effect until a few dB above the threshold. So to explain that in more numerically, if we set the knee a little bit higher so it's nice and curved, what we're going to see is, even though the ratio of the compressor is set to 4 to 1, it's going to start compressing below the threshold, maybe 1.5 to 1, 2 to 1, and it's going to start increasing how much it's compressing, the ratio, as it approaches the threshold. When it gets right to the threshold, it's compressing closer and closer to 4 to 1, and as it goes past the threshold, it really gets into the 4 to 1 compression. So it's a slow, gradual increase in compression, as opposed to if the knee was set to 0. There's no compression, no compression, no compression as you approach the threshold, and then bam, all the compression is happening. Neither one of those is wrong. It may sound like a higher knee is better, and it really just depends on what you're going for. For a lot of things, if I want the compression to be smooth and I don't want to hear it kick on and off, then I'll use a little bit of a higher knee so it's a nice soft transition. But we'll get into that later, but that's what the knee does. You're not going to see that on every compressor, like I said, but it is actually on the stock Digi compressor that comes with Pro Tools, so something to keep in mind. Okay, the next thing we need to look at is the gain knob over here. This is really important because this is where when you get the idea that compression increases the overall volume, even though it's turning things down and decreasing dynamic range, it's actually increasing the overall volume of the track. That's because there is a gain stage to this plugin. So if we bring our threshold down, we've got a nice ratio here. As we can see, we're compressing it quite a bit. So the signal is getting turned down by, looks like around 6 dB for the most part. Now, what you'll hear, and what you can see here through the meters here, is that the input level is here and the output level is down here. So the signal is quieter because it went through the compressor. And that makes sense, right? Because you're turning it down. So far, all we've done is brought the signal in, turned it down, and spit it back out. Well, we've decreased the dynamic range, which is good, but let's say we want it to get back to that same level that it was. Well, that's where this gain comes in. And as we increase the gain, you'll notice the output meter turns up more. And, excuse me, you'll notice the graph over here also goes up, which represents a louder volume. Now, have we increased the amount of compression? It's a good question. You tell me. As I increase the gain, keep an eye on the gain reduction meter here. Tell me if that gets any different. As I turn that up and down, it's not changing at all. It's all around 6 to 10 dB of gain reduction. So adjusting the gain doesn't affect the compression at all. It simply turns up the signal after it's been compressed. So now this compressed signal, this signal with less dynamic range, has more volume. So why is that important? Well, the idea here is that we're using compression to chop off, let's say, the louder sections of the drums. Because if we left compression off entirely, let's say it was a 0-to-1 ratio, which is basically no compression, or 1-to-1 ratio, then the signal's coming through and it might be clipping, or it might just be too loud. So we turn on compression to turn down those louder parts. And now the louder parts are turned down, but the entire drum kit itself isn't loud enough. That's where we can turn up the gain. So now we've made everything louder, and the loudest parts of the drums aren't being compressed, or aren't too loud, and they're not going through and clipping things or standing out as too loud because they've been turned down. So those parts got turned down. The quieter parts that aren't above the threshold are turned up, and the result is a compressed sound that comes out louder than it was before. So that's the big three as far as knobs go are threshold, ratio, and gain. Those are your three. You're going to mess around when you compress. You're going to mess with those probably more than anything else. And then you'll come to the knee. You'll mess around with that some. And the next thing is attack and release. So we've covered the threshold says at what level compression starts. Ratio says how much compression happens once it is compressing. The knee tells us how gradually it starts compressing, meaning does it start compressing below the threshold a little bit. And gain tells us how much we're increasing the overall volume of the compressed signal. Now the attack and release. Those are two things that when I first started using compression, I didn't mess with. I just left them where they were. I didn't really know how to use them. And we'll get into practical applications of how they work. But basically, attack tells us how quickly the compressor is going to compress. So let's say the signal crosses the threshold, and let's say just for simplicity's sake that it's supposed to turn the signal down by 5 dB. So the goal is for the signal to be turned down by 5 dB or 5 dB of gain reduction. Well, if we have an attack set to really, really small, this is microseconds, then it's going to turn it down. Let's say we set the attack to 1 millisecond. Then that means when the compressor kicks in, it's going to take the compressor 1 millisecond to turn down the signal by those 5 dB. So for a slower attack, that means the signal's going to hit the compressor and get turned down really fast. If we turn the attack up, let's say to 100, now it's going to take 100 milliseconds for the compressor to turn that signal down by 5 dB. So what does that mean? Well, if you have a longer attack, then more of the punch or the attack of the signal itself is going to cut through before it gets turned down. So this is a way to allow, let's say with drums, you have the hit of the snare, and he smacks the snare with the stick, and there's that initial really loud section of that transient. Well, you want to compress it, but you also want that transient to cut through a little bit. Well, what you can do is you can mess around with the attack. A really, really slow attack is going to chop off that transient as soon as he hits the drum head, and it's going to turn that down. As you raise the attack and make it a little bit slower, it's going to let more and more of that transient come through, so that doesn't get compressed, and it's just the rest of the signal that gets compressed. Let me show you that on screen here. That'll probably help. Let's look at our snare drum track here. Okay, as you can see, and we've all seen this before, this is what your typical snare drum looks like. It's got this really loud section here, and let me switch to minutes and seconds. Okay, the really loud section here, and then it trails off here. And this is all what comprises the sound of a snare drum. And as you can see, the loudest section is only about, as you can see here, that's about 15 milliseconds. So after 15 milliseconds, it starts to get quieter, and the rest of it goes on for a couple hundred milliseconds or so. So when you're compressing this, let's say you set it to start compressing right here. And so that's your threshold. As soon as the snare gets above that, it's going to start compressing. Okay? So that means at the very beginning of this snare hit, it's going to start compressing. Now, what you do, if you want it to compress by that amount at that level, but you want it to hold off, and maybe you don't want these first few samples to get compressed as much as the rest of the sound, then what you can do is raise the attack so it's a little bit longer. So it crosses the threshold here, but if your attack is set to 10 milliseconds, it's not going to reach the full compression amount until it gets to here. So this first little section of the snare drum is going to cut through, and then the rest will be compressed. So it's a good way to compromise too. A lot of times compressing a snare, for example, will bring out the sound of the drum, the wood of the drum, or the sound of the snares on the bottom, and it helps to bring all that out. But obviously, if you compress it too much or with too fast of an attack, then the beginning of the snare gets turned down and it doesn't cut through. The drummer hits the snare and you just don't really hear it. And that's what that's what attack will let you do. So messing around with the attack is really important. When I'm mixing bass, for example, if I do a lower attack, then the bass has this nice smooth sound, especially if the bass player is really inconsistent. Some notes are a lot louder than others. Then if I use a faster attack, then every note becomes about the same volume, and I can work with it from there. Conversely, if the bass isn't punching through as well as I want it to, then I'll lower the attack. And then that lets the first punch of the note that he played come through before it gets compressed, and then the rest of the note gets compressed. So another way of putting it is the attack or the punch or the transient of the note doesn't get compressed or gets lightly compressed, and then the sustain of the note is what gets the bulk of the compression. If you're a guitarist, you probably understand this already, especially if you use a compressor pedal on your pedal board. If you're an electric guitarist, it's the same idea. You're doing this you can do it to any track, not just guitar. Now the release, as you can probably imagine, has to do with how quickly the compressor lets go of compressing the signal after the signal drops back below the threshold. So if the threshold's set to here, let's say, the signal comes above here, it gets compressed, and as it drops down, at this point, when it comes back down to the level of the threshold, then there's obviously some compression going on. And as it drops below, wherever you set the release to is how quickly the compressor turns off, or how quickly it gets rid of the compression and stops compressing the signal entirely. And this is helpful if I normally don't mess with the release nearly as much as the attack, but let's say it's a kick drum and it compresses it and it's slowly letting off that compression so the kick drum has a nice sustained sort of sound to it. If you set the release too slow, then it will stop compressing as soon as it drops the threshold, and it may not have as much sustain. If you do a longer release, then the sustain of whatever you're compressing is going to be exaggerated. And so you can make the guitar sound like they're sustaining a little longer, even when they drop below the threshold. And there's just a lot of different things you can do with that. All that said, I normally leave the compressor to roughly the default. Don't make it too long so it's compressing for 4 seconds. That's really not useful. And not too short so where the compressor is constantly pumping on and off, because you can hear that. So I usually leave it somewhere in the middle, and I'm usually happy with that. So the release, if you don't touch the release very much, you'll probably be okay. The attack, however, can really change how the compressor works. For one thing, as you lower the attack, the amount of compression is increased. Check this out. See, the attack is up here around 50 milliseconds, and you'll see it's compressing by, let's say, 2 to 3 dB. As I lower the attack, check out what's happening. It's now compressing by negative 12 dB. The reason for that, we've told it to, rather than compressing way over here at around 40 or 50 milliseconds, it's compressing around here where the signal's much louder. So it has to turn that down a lot more because it's crossed way over the threshold. So that's another thing to keep in mind. If you turn down the attack on something, you're going to increase the compression, which may or may not be a good thing depending on what you're going for. So lots of things to keep in mind. Compression is not necessarily the simplest thing. And it's one of those things, if you don't understand it, you almost don't even want to open up a compressor. But compression, as you can see in this mix, I've got a compressor on a lot of these tracks. And they're doing different things. Some are compressing just a little bit, some are compressing a lot more. But it's really helpful to know how to use it and why you would use it then you can use it with confidence. So let me show you a few different compressors here. This is one from Waves. You'll see it looks very familiar. We've got the threshold setting, which is represented here. Actually, I'm sorry, this is a gate. That's not helping anybody. Let me show you the other one. Okay, so we've got the threshold here, you got the ratio here. You'll notice it makes the line go that way. Attack and release settings, and the makeup gain. Sometimes you'll see the gain of a compressor, whereas we saw over here it was called gain. On this particular compressor, it's called makeup. It's basically makeup gain, meaning you turned it down with the compressor, you're going to turn it back up with the makeup gain to get the level back that you took away with compression. So that's your compressor may say something like that. And then here's our output gain too. This has actually separate, two different stages of output gain. So that's a compressor. That one looks a lot like the one we just looked at. The Renaissance compressor looks even more different. You've got your threshold here, your ratio here, and your gain here. So you can see, if we find a spot, as we bring this threshold down, this is the amount of gain reduction, and this is our output. So just lots of fun little things there that you can mess around with, which is really cool. And that's just a couple of compressors. There's a lot out there. I use this bus compressor from Waves for my master mix. Here's the same things: threshold, makeup gain, attack, release, ratio. They're all right there, and here's our meter. So again, we're talking about the same things. They just look different and they sound different, but they all do the same thing. So hopefully this has cleared up any questions as far as what the components of a compressor are and what they do. And now we'll move forward and jump in and look at specifics of what compression sounds like and how to use it to get the sounds that you're going for. Okay, thanks for watching this video. We'll see you in the next one.